Hello, I've gathered lots of lovely leaves, some of them still green, some of them just turning browns and oranges, and I thought it'd be lovely to print these using my jelly print technique, and I'll talk you through how I'm going to do that. I'm using several different colours. But I'm mostly using burnt umber, Venice red, turquoise, and then various different shades of Naples yellow. They're kind of cream, but some of them have a slight warmer tint or a reddish tint or a greenish tint. And first of all, I'm putting the paint onto the plate, and I'm not worrying overly about it being too even, because sometimes I quite like the variation that you get. I'm starting off with these sycamore leaves, and I've gathered, as well as the leaves, I've got some of the seed heads as well. You know, when you're a child you sort of call them helicopters, because as they float down from a tree they sort of make that movement, don't they? I'm using the leaves with the vein side down because then you'll get more of an impression into your paint. So I'm just having a little think about the composition and deciding where I want to put the leaves and the seed heads. And I'm using just some good quality cartridge paper, and for this first print I'm pushing it down to take as much of the surrounding paint off as possible, plus I'm also pushing the leaves and the seed heads into the paint to make a good impression. And you can either wait for it to dry, or you can do what I'm doing here, which is speed up the process with a hairdryer. I don't know why I'm using my good hairdryer rather than my little travel hairdryer. Maybe I couldn't find it. And it usually doesn't take very long because the paint is quite thin and acrylic paint dries quickly. So once it's completely dry, I'm going to apply another layer of paint in order to be able to pull both layers off. And for this one I'm using, I think, one of the Naples yellows. I'm using the Naples yellow light, and I'm mixing in a bit of turquoise as well to get a more interesting effect. And you can either mix your paints in a palette, or you can do as I'm doing here, actually mix it on the plate. It depends how even a look you want. And again, you can spend longer rolling it out to get quite an even coat like I did here. So I'm putting my piece of paper back on. I'd already put a piece of tape so that I could get it back in the same position. And I'm pressing really firmly in order to get good contact. Then off camera, I've waited a few minutes for it to dry. I'd say preferably 5 or 10 minutes, or much longer if you want. So this is my first one of this run. I really like those colours, but some of the print is a little bit patchy, so I thought I'd try using the same leaves and seed heads and do another version. And this time I'm using the Venice red straight on the plate and mixing in a little bit of burnt umber. And something you'll see throughout this is that I didn't particularly clean off my roller in between doing these prints. And sometimes I do. This time I quite like getting that little bit of grunginess when you're not quite sure what colour's going to come. I kind of like the serendipity of that. So I'm going to use a very similar composition because I think that worked quite well. And you'll find that you can reuse these leaves through a whole session, and sometimes you can use them another day as well. They tend to be quite robust. Later in the season, I like to use those more skeletal leaves that you can find, and they'll probably only be good for a few prints, but they are more robust than you think. And you can see when you've got something thicker, like the seed head here, that the stalk was quite thick, if you want to get a really good impression, you do have to press quite firmly and try and get in round the edges. It depends what kind of paper you're using. This is a sort of medium weight, so it's not too difficult, but it's easier if you're using calligraphy paper or tissue paper, and it's that much harder if you're using watercolour paper. So again, I've waited for this to dry. I didn't use the hairdryer this time. I think I went off and did something else. It's quite good if you've got something else on the go at the same time. Then you're not hovering over waiting for it to dry, which I do sometimes. And I'm using one of these, as I said, these Naples yellow shades that are, the maker's Amsterdam. And I just like this slightly greeny cream, really. And when you roll out your paint, if you can see your original image underneath, just faintly, that's a good amount of paint to be using. So again, I taped my paper for the first time, so I'd made sure that it would go down in exactly the right position. It's called registering. And this one came out better. It made a much better contact with the plate. And I really like the subtlety of the colours in that one. And now I'm using a yellow ochre, which isn't a colour I use very often because it's kind of a sort of mustard colour, which isn't one of my favourites. But I thought it went with these other autumnal colours that I'm using. And again, you can see there was still a little bit of brown on that roller. But I don't mind that at all. In fact, I think it kind of toned down the brightness of the ochre. I did take some of the excess off my roller. I always have a piece of paper at my side, which is often quite interesting by the end of the session. And although there are one or two patches where it hasn't blended out completely, I don't think that matters too much. It can add to interest in the background. And I'm using this beautiful Virginia creeper. It comes into my garden for my neighbours, and sometimes I think, oh, it'd be nice if they cut it back a bit, but actually it's very beautiful, and it's just, some of it's just starting to turn colour, some of it's gone the amazing shade of red that it does, but it's got a pretty shape, and I hadn't printed with this before, so I was interested to see how well it would work. And I always quite like that when something's going off the edge of the image, don't feel you've got to put something in the middle. It can be much more interesting and dynamic like this. And because these leaves are thinner, it's easier. You don't have to do lots of manipulating to get the paper to go round all the contours, but I'm still giving it a good press because I don't know, as I say, I haven't used this before and I don't know how veiny the leaves are and how well they'll show up. So I'm putting out a shot, I'm putting my masking tape on my piece of paper so that when I lift it up and put it down again, it will be in the same place. So let's see how well this is taken. I don't know how much it shows on camera, but there's actually quite a lot of detail of veining, so I'm pleased with that. And I really like this composition. And I think just having that little bit of, I think actually it was a bit of the Venice red that was still on my roller. It's given it a more of a golden yellow rather than a true sort of mustard yellow. Again, I'm using one of these Naples yellow shades. This is the one red. It's got a very slight warm hue, sort of undertone to it really. And I can, again, it might not show on camera, but I can just make out the first image through the paint, so that's the right level of thickness to get a good reveal. And this is after a few minutes. And then because there were one or two bits that hadn't come up, I put it down again and applied a bit more pressure. So that's something you can always do. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's always worth a try. And I think I got most of it up, just one or two bits. And actually, I really liked, I think this is probably my favourite of the whole lot. I love the variation in the background and the subtle contrast. So I'm using the Naples yellow green, which just has the very faintest tint of green, and I find it goes well with a lot of different colours, so I do use this one a lot. And to show you that you can, it's always good to have a bit of a contrast, but you can do it both ways. So in the first couple I was using the dark colour first and then a paler colour, but I'm doing it the other way around here. And I'm using these beautiful oak leaves that are still quite green, but have a wonderful shape, of course. And these are quite thick, kind of leathery leaves, so I want to apply a lot of pressure in order to get round all the edges and make sure that the veins and other details are really embedding into that layer of paint. So that's me putting a bit of masking tape on the piece of paper. Double checking that I've got all the edges. You can see I'm being really thorough because I'm worried about how thick these leaves are. And carefully peeling off the leaves, and even on camera I think you can see that quite a lot of the detail has transferred to the paint. And I've waited for that to dry, and now I'm using Venice red to lift it off. I think maybe there wasn't quite enough contrast because it did come out quite pale because I didn't use very much and I spread it quite thinly. So it's quite a translucent layer. So this is after it's been drying for several minutes. And this is a really subtle one. but I do like it. It gives quite a sort of ethereal effect. It's quite different to the other prints I made in this session. What do you think? Do you like this one? And I thought I'd try using the oak leaves again, but with a much stronger colour. So I'm using a mixture of this dark, slightly yellowy sort of blue and turquoise. And again, I think there was a little bit of the Venice red on my roller, and that will add to the mix and add a bit of interest. I think probably I was a bit heavy-handed with the paint. You can see that I'm rolling some of it off. I'm doing a very similar composition to the first one because I thought that worked quite well. So it's already been a few minutes. I've gone away and come back again. So again, as before, I'm pressing very firmly for quite a long time in order to get all the marks into the paint, particularly around that stalk area. So this is obviously once it's dried, and I think this was the Naples yellow red. It was the Naples yellow red. So it's quite good. Because it's got a slight bit of warmth, it contrasts to the greeniness that's in the blue. And I obviously wanted to add a little bit more warmth, which is why I'm putting just a very small bit of the Venice red into the mix. So lots of pressure, and then I leave it for quite a few minutes. I think this is quite a striking combination, and I do really like those colours. And you can see how interesting the background looks because it's got that variation. Now I'm adding this rather luminous bright orange, which I do use quite a lot of my work, into the mix, and I've added a little bit of the Prussian blue to get a kind of grungy olivey green. I think that's what I was going for, and it takes quite a lot of mixing. And I'm printing this time with some grasses. This is actually a cultivated grass that I grow in my garden called Panicum violaceum, because before it's dried out to this level it is a sort of dark greyish purple. At this point it's starting to turn, and what I didn't realise was that, well, I should have realised if I thought about it, that it was quite likely to shed some of these seeds, and you can see what happened in a moment. But they're a beautiful, graceful grass. think I decided that one wasn't a very good, I decided this was a better specimen to use for the print. It's a good idea if you've got long stalks to cut them off, because they can move around and make the whole thing a little bit messy. And because there's lots of texture with these, I'm having to do the pressing thing really carefully to get around all the bumpy bits. Now, when I lifted these grasses up, it left quite a few seeds behind, but I think I didn't realise at this stage. But I really like the colours, and rather than going for too much of a contrast, I've decided to use the Naples yellow green to keep everything in kind of the same key. And when I rolled this out, I could see then that there were several seeds. Probably, yes, I did try and lift some of them off now, but it was a little bit too late for this print. So as I pulled this up, you can see what happened. There's a lesson there. Remove your seeds before you take your next layer off. But this print, I will show you, I've used it in a book recently, one of my art books, and what I sometimes do in those places where you've lost some of the print for whatever reason, I quite like to fill it in with coloured pencils, and it's amazing how you can do that and then the eye just doesn't really notice. And then I don't know why I didn't really clean those off properly then. I started putting some more of the orange down, I think. Oh no, it was the Venice red. And it was only kind of when I was rolling out this paint, I think, that I realised they were sticking there and were going to ruin my next print. And then I used just some kitchen paper to make sure that I'd removed those seed bits, to make sure I'd removed those seeds. And then I did a good lot of swirling with the roller to make sure the plate was evenly coated. And then I'm going to risk trying the same thing again, hoping I didn't get the same problem. I think they're very pretty, all sort of splayed out like that. So it's definitely worth another go. So I've learnt my lesson this time, and when I took the paper off and then the grasses, I got my tweezers, which is quite a handy tool to have in your art kit, and try to take the seeds out without disturbing the paint underneath. I'm not sure I got every single one. Turns out there were quite a lot left on here. Don't say I don't suffer for my art. So left it to dry, although it probably was by the time I'd finished doing that, and I think I'm using the Naples yellow green again, and mixing a little bit of turquoise. It's quite a good even coat, and I've mixed the colours in pretty much. So this has been left for several minutes. Just do a last rub. Right, let's see if it's worked this time. Oops, there's one I missed. And I think another one. But actually, I'm pleased with that. There's just one, but it does show how having just one seed stops that piece of paper there making contact with the plate. But again, I can fill that in with some coloured pencils. So I'm going back to the burnt umber now. I know not everybody loves brown, but I like to use it like a neutral. I rarely use black. I'd much rather use a dark brown or a dark blue. I just think it gives more life to a piece. And now I'm using these beautiful beech leaves. Now these have been treated slightly. I'll link the video up here that shows you how to do this. It's just very simple preservation where you leave them in some diluted glycerin for a few days, and that gets absorbed into the stem and the leaves, making them stay flexible rather than drying out. I did that because I was thinking about wreaths and dried flower arrangements, but then I realised it actually had good application when printing with leaves. Putting my masking tape down, and I'd say that these ones aren't quite as thick as the oak leaves, and they did make a good impression in the paint. You can see what lovely marks the beech leaves left. I think after the Virginia creeper, these were probably my favourite ones. So I'm using the luminous orange again with the Naples yellow light. And I took some of the excess off then onto my roll-off sheet. So again, this has been left for a few minutes. I love this sort of beautiful, subtle variation in the colours and the marks with this one. So because I like that so much, I'm going to do it in a slightly different colourway. So I'm using some Prussian blue, but there is some brown left on my roller, so that's going to make it slightly more grungier. And again, rather than trying to get it into the middle of the plate, I'm doing it so it slightly goes over the edges for a more kind of, it just sort of looks a bit more alive like that, I think. Putting the masking tape down. And then going in and making sure I've got all those edges. And I'm just going back in to get that area of paint that didn't lift in the bottom right corner. That's better. And this is a little bit later after it's dry, and I'd already applied I think it was a little bit of the Venice red and some of the Naples yellow red to give a really nice warm contrast to the Prussian blue. And you can, with the paler colours on top, you can really see that there's a ghost of the image underneath, and that shows you've got just the kind of level of coverage to make a good pull. And again, I think that's quite a successful print. I must do some more with the beech leaves. So for my last couple of prints in this session, I decided to use some eucalyptus leaves, which I have growing in my garden. And I think this was just the Naples yellow red, because it's got that slight warm cast to it. So again, this is using the pale first and the darker colour second for a slightly different look. And these are such sort of elegant sprays of leaf. And again, this needed quite a lot of pressing down because there's so many edges and stalks, because I've used a couple of these sprays. And after waiting for it to dry, of course, I'm using, this is a dark turquoise this time. So I'm keeping this one quite simple with just a 2-colour contrast. Although having said that, you can see there's a little bit of the Prussian blue left on my roller. And you can quite clearly see on this contrast that you can see the the leaves. You can see the first layer through this layer of paint, so I'm hoping that means it will give me a good pull. So after the obligatory few minutes, let's see how this one turns out. I think there are one or two areas that needed a little bit more coaxing. I love this one, and I think it's very subtle, and it just shows the different effects. By having paints that are tonally not too different, you get a very different look to it. So I think this is the last one of this session, so I'm going to use the Eucalyptus again, but this time going back to my burnt umber. But as you can see, there's still a little bit of blue left on my roller, so it's giving a slightly sort of greeny brown. And I'm going for a slightly different composition this time. So that's made a delicate transfer into the paint, and of course I'm waiting for that to dry before I go in with my next colours. And this time I'm using, you can see it's got a slight green tint, it's the Naples yellow green. Let's see how this one's turned out. Yeah, that's quite nice, isn't it? So here are all the prints that I did in this session, and I really hope that you've enjoyed seeing them, and it might inspire you to go out and start collecting leaves and seed heads and see what beautiful prints you can make.